Hey, it's Nathan, and today I'm going to show you how to mix synths. So I've got this electronic track here, and I've got 3 synth tracks that are playing inside of it that are handling all the kind of melodic and chordal effects. So what we're going to do is we're going to play everything, and then we'll dive right in. So let's have a quick listen to everything first. So to start things off, typically when I've got an electronic track, if I have a chord that is a pad, I tend to do the mixing on the chord pad first, just because I treat it like it's kind of like a background thing. And since in a lot of cases with pads, I'm just subtracting out a lot of frequencies. So we're going to take a look at what I've done here. On the pad, I've got 2 kind of EQ devices in series, and all I've done here with this pad, which we're going to be playing in a moment, is I've high passed it at about 250 hertz with an 18 per dB octave filter. That means I'm cutting out all the low frequencies. So if we listen to the pad right now and I enable and disable this, you'll hear how it just cleans it up. So that high pass is set up because I have this pad layered with my sub so that it plays like this kind of like smooth, kind of just mellow, just rounded, just pad layer. And I've set it up that way. So because the low frequencies are being handled by my sub, I cut them out pretty high. In fact, on this one, it's unusually high. Typically, I'll cut, if I'm layering with a sub like this, which is just a sub, I will cut it at about 150 hertz. This one just sounded better at 250. So that's what I've done there. And then with the pad, I've also over here on just a standard EQ, I've removed at about 900 hertz. And that's probably to get rid of some of the presence that the pad has, to leave that space for the other synths which are going to be competing for it. So let's go ahead and play everything now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to enable and disable this EQ dip so you can hear how it kind of just clusterfucks everything. So we'll play everything and we'll hear how that just ruins our track. All right, here we go. Okay, so I sold a very big dramatic change. That wasn't very dramatic. In fact, that EQ change, I wouldn't say was necessary, but in a lot of cases, I find myself making that kind of EQ dip because it does leave room for these instruments to poke through. And, you know, it just sounds better to me anyway because it pushes the pad further in the back. And that sounds better because it's a pad. It's supporting everything else. So next we're going to move on to our kind of main arpeggiator, which is this kind of guitar synth, which I'm going to solo for you. And then we'll get right into this whole little fun chain over here. So this is our guitar synth. The first thing that I wanted with it was I wanted something that kind of just sounded muffled, like it was playing through a radio. So I use this wonderful guitar amp plugin that I have by, I believe it's a company called Positive Grid, and it's just a guitar amp virtualizer thingamabob. Anyway, it's really cool. I just, pop it in, play with some buttons, and it just turns out pretty cool. So I'm not going to go into depth with this particular tool because it's just a little bit involved. But the cool thing about any guitar amp or distortion's pretty much finger painting with sound design. You sort of know what you're doing, but in a lot of cases, it's a pretty random, controlled result. You have control, but there's a lot of elements that you just can't really predict. So we're leaving that out. We're hopping onto the EQ. What I've done here is I've done some pretty standard high passing to just clean up the low end of this guitar because we have our pad and our sub, which are down there, and we want to keep that clean. So we'll play everything in the entire track, and we'll just listen to how this kind of cleans it up. So you can hear how that it takes a little bit of like the woolliness out of that instrument. I wouldn't say it's terribly noticeable, but the art of mixing is that a lot of the things that you do are not very noticeable, but a lot of very minute things add up to a very big mixing effect when you reach the final result. So that's kind of the idea, is small, smart choices to clean your mix up and leave room for the things that count. So we're going to move here to these kind of middle dips at 700 hertz and then 1.6K. The obvious reason that I've done this is because I'm just taking a little bit of the forward presence out of this arpeggiated guitar type synth, because the reason for that is it's kind of sitting further back in the mix, and the rest of the mix choices following this are kind of going to support that. So we're going to play everything in the context of the mix, and you'll hear how these kind of affect the forwardness of the guitar. Okay, so you can tell that just pushes the guitar back a little further, makes it sound just jelly, except for this, I didn't plan for this. Our mix is over. It's ruined. I have to start over. Oh man, I'm just wreaking havoc over here. All right, so I did a little bit of a top end boost, which I probably made when I was first mixing this track, because you're going to notice that I actually end up canceling it out because of the filtering I have. So this doesn't really matter. But in some cases where when I was initially mixing this track, I wanted this guitar to be more forward, and what you can do sometimes is you can get rid of some of the body and leave space for other elements like we did right here, and then you can kind of give it a little more presence by boosting in the 8 kilohertz range. So it's a cool little technique to have in your back pocket, but not necessary. So we're going to move on to the next tool, which is the drop. I love this filter effect. It's great. I mean, I don't really need to talk about this one that much. It's a solid tool. Anyway, so all I'm doing is I'm just filtering this guitar down so it pushes it in the far back of the mix. So we're going to A-B this, and you'll hear how it just transforms the entire track. It just messes with the balance. So here we go. So there's not much of a point of A-Bing that one, just because it completely changes the kind of space that that instrument sits in. So we're just going to move on. Filtering typically isn't something that you need to think too much about. So what we're going to do is show you the next one, which is Virtual Tape Machine. Now, I love this tool. I don't use it as much as I used to, because pretty much what it is it's a saturation tool. Whatever you put into it gets a little more even and odd order harmonics, which are basically just those nice fuzzy sounds that you hear on things when you want it to sound nice and warm. And because this is a distorted sound and I wanted it to sound kind of fuzzy and old school, I put this on there. So I'm going to A-B it again with everything playing, and you'll hear how it affects it. So that's pretty obvious. It just kind of gives that ARP a little more fullness and just helps it balance better in the mix. So I love the sound of that. And now we're going to move on to some effects that I put on this, since it was a kind of a pretty important element of our track. We're going to start with our delay. And this is just a standard 1/8 delay. 1/8 dotted delay, and it just gives it a kind of cool effect. We'll A-B it so you can hear it. So it gives it just a really nice syncopation in there. It just sounds sweet. So we're going to move on to our reverb now. We're not going to go too deep into this, but it's just a standard reverb that I put on the instrument just to help it blend with everything. When it comes to reverb, I'll go into that in more detail in another tutorial. But in general, I tend to run as few reverbs as possible. Typically a short room or a small room reverb, and then a medium room reverb, which is a longer tail, and then a large kind of hall-like reverb, which basically sounds like that huge cathedral party at the end of the third Matrix where they have that huge rave. So that's basically the difference in sound that you're going for, but we're not trying to have an orgy with our sound design right now. So we're just going to listen to how this affects everything, and then we'll kind of move forward with that. Actually, we're going to A-B it with the whole entire track playing so you can hear how the reverb kind of fits it in the mix. So you can really hear how that reverb just cleans everything up. It really fits it in the mix. Not really so much that it cleans it up. I don't know where I was when I said that. But basically the idea behind the reverb was to kind of get that instrument to sit further back in the mix, to sound like it's coming from farther away compared to everything else, because it's all about depth. And I bet you can't wait till I go really into detail how I do that, because it's a pretty complex deal, but we're not going to touch on that this tutorial. So we're going to move to our last instrument, which is, I called the drop. Sometimes I'm terrible at naming things, but we're going to look at it, and there's some pretty aggressive EQing here. We're going to listen to this instrument right now so you know which one it is. So you've obviously heard it this entire time. It's kind of just filling out the kind of top end of our mix, giving a nice little support in terms of just melody. Anyway, so because this instrument, it was very bright and naturally drew attention, I was able to cut a lot out. Because sometimes, you just want something that just kind of fills out in a gentle way. And this is actually surprisingly forward for how much I cut out of it, which is why we cut so much. So we're going to listen to these kind of low cut effects, and then we'll play the whole track, and I'll just A-B this one right here at 500 hertz, and you can hear how it affects it. So you can hear how that high-pass filter just kind of cleans up the low end of that drop instrument. And that's important because you want to keep that clean for your bass. It's very important that you keep pretty much everything below 300 hertz relatively clean for your bass, depending on what kind of bass you have. In this track, you can actually pull these down further because we really just have a sub. But since our chord is acting as this kind of frequency area here from 100 to about 400, we cut it out. So that just cleaned things up. And these last two are just removing that presence. A lot of the sensitivity that our ears have is at about 1 hertz, or 1K, or 1000 hertz. And then especially at 2K. 2K is where we're most sensitive. So you just cut it out at these frequencies, and what it's going to do is if it was super present, which you'll hear right now, so it's pretty surprising how much I really had to cut out to get this to sit. Sometimes you just want the high-end detail of that instrument, and you don't need the meat because there's a lot. So the last thing I did was, this is a fairly common technique. I think I heard like Nicky Romero say it in a tutorial like ages ago. And he says he likes to just low-pass filter a lot of things. Because when you're working in digital, the frequencies at about 17K and up just can become harsh and build up in your tracks. So I find that on a lot of instruments, it's not terribly audible, but oftentimes I cut at this frequency. But I don't want you to get the idea that I'm doing it because of that rule. I'm doing it on the instruments where I hear that it needs that to be cut to just kind of round it out a little more. Obviously, if you're making like a grinding, just really aggressive track, you may want these frequencies. So it's just depending on what you want to hear. And so I'm going to play the entire track, and we'll listen to how this affects it. So it's pretty subtle, but it definitely rounds out that top end and gives it a kind of nicer smoothness. So the next thing we're going to move on to, or the last thing, is that we put a reverb directly on this track. Since this instrument was just far back in the mix, and that's how I wanted it to sound epic. In some cases, if I want like a really aggressive reverb on something, I tend to put it directly on the instrument. Not always, but in a lot of cases I do, because if I have it sent to a send, I have to control the volume and the wetness of the reverb separately, because this fader becomes our dry volume, and the one that would be over here in this area would be our wet volume. In some cases, I'm lazy, and I think that it's best to do the thing that makes it easiest on you, which includes using presets, even though I started not using presets. But anyway, that's another discussion. Because it's about making it easy on yourself, you can essentially, what you can do is you just have a mix knob here, or a fader, which allows you to control both the wetness and the volume mix at the same time. So the more the mix reaches the top at 100%, the more it's just purely wet, and you just hear the reverb effect. The more it goes down, you just hear the dry effect. So this is what I do if I need to have like aggressive control of the reverb wetness. So we're going to listen to this, how it affects the track. It's a long tail reverb, which, as you can see here, it's 11 seconds long. It's just going to make it sound huge, big, and fancy. So let's listen to the track and we'll hear it right now. So it's pretty cool. I love the sound of Valhalla reverb. We'll get more familiar with it in the future. It's a great workhorse reverb, honestly. It's if you need one, buy this one. It's $50. The guy's a great developer. He just crushes it, and he deserves every penny for making something so fantastic and affordable. So anyway, I actually want to show you the effect of using this mix knob right here, how it really allows you just kind of more control than having the volume and send setup, which I'm actually going to demonstrate for you right now in case you guys are wondering what I'm talking about. So we're going to make a send track. We've got our send track here. Turn the wetness all the way up to 100 on your sends. And I'm just going to show you how this mix knob gives us full control over the wetness of this instrument while everything's playing. So let's listen right now. So the other alternative is to have a send track. In this case, you have a dry volume control for your track, and then you have a send, which is just the full wet signal that you're getting. And this is more useful for if you just have elements that are just being somewhat standardly mixed inside of your song, which are typically being sent to about 3 different reverbs. You have a small one, a medium one, and a large one, which we'll get into in another tutorial, but I'm going to show you what happens here when I mess with these separately. It essentially gives you less immediate control that you have to then finesse. It takes more work, and because I'm lazy in some ways, this is what I do sometimes. So let's listen. Okay, so it just gives you a little less control, though in a lot of cases you tend to use reverbs as sends. It's a more organized way that gives you more control over the cohesiveness of your track. You typically don't use individual reverbs on instruments because it'll get sloppy quick because you have to configure all of them separately, and you can't unify the reverbs for the different kind of rooms that you want to place things in. So, like I said, we'll get into that in the next tutorial. Now that I think about it, that would be a great thing to do. So we'll talk about reverb in the next one. We'll get you guys very familiar with that. I think I have a great system for it. So if you guys enjoyed this video, I hope you enjoyed it. If you like this video, please like this video below. Leave a comment or a question if you have any questions. They're appreciated, and they will potentially influence the next video. So have a good one, guys. See ya.